A couple of notes here before we go to our next speaker. First of all, this session is being taped today by the soon-to-be launched magazine called The New Territory. And its editor-in-chief has joined us today, Tina Casagrande. This magazine will cover the 4 states of Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. So be watching for this regionalist-leaning magazine in coming months called The New Territory. I also wanted to thank Jay Schaefer at Kansas Public Radio, who did an interview with a couple of our speakers today. And that interview has been running on Kansas Public Radio the last couple of days. Also want to thank Dirk Lammers of the Associated Press, who put news of this session on the wire, and that has generated several emails to me about how people can learn more about the session. And thanks to Tina, this will be out there on the interwebs very soon. All right, our next speaker today is Catherine Schumacher. She is an assistant professor of classics and letters at the University of Oklahoma, where she teaches a variety of classes. Catherine, she's a Midwesterner, grew up in Minnesota, Winona, and she received her PhD in history from the University of Chicago in 2013. Her research focuses on civil rights and the history of childhood and youth. And her current book project, which she's currently working on, is entitled Civil Rights at the Schoolhouse Gate: Student Protest and the Struggle for Racial Reform. Please join us, Catherine.
Thank you. I'm going to do this a little differently. I didn't actually script out a paper for the first time ever. And I thought about how to do the presentation because in a similar way, feel like kind of an outsider because my current project has changed focus. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about how I got to where I am now, where I'm writing a more national story from where I started, which was as a budding historian of the Midwest. So my interest in the Midwest and in Midwestern history began as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And I was casting out ideas for a dissertation project, and I kept coming across Cairo, Illinois. Like, this city just kept popping up everywhere I looked when I was thinking and reading about civil rights in the Midwest. It was popping up as an outlier, and not that much had been written about it, so I was curious to learn more. So I started looking into Cairo, and it's a strange city. So people would cast it as a southern city. So it was a southern city in a northern state, and that always struck me as a big problem, right? Because it's not in the South, it's in Illinois, it's subject to the laws of Illinois. And so when I was thinking about the dissertation, I descended on the research question, which is, what did the implementation of civil rights reforms look like in the Midwest? So the Midwest is an interesting region from an African-American history perspective, also civil rights perspective, because in terms of the state laws, it was relatively racially liberal. So after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, Congress passed civil rights laws, so the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which the Supreme Court then threw out to the civil rights cases in 1883. And so my dissertation looked at these moments in the late 19th century in order to put what happens in the 20th in context. So in the late 18th century, there's 2 moments when there's a lot of civil rights law writing, and also in terms of revisions of state constitutions. And the first is right after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Lots of Midwestern states revised their state constitutions to take out references to race and qualifications that were based on whiteness. And also after the Supreme Court's repeal of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, a lot of states passed their own public accommodations laws. So when I look at a place like Cairo, or I looked at a place like Waterloo, Iowa, or Benton Harbor, Michigan, all of which became case studies for my dissertation, the question was always there, which is, how did these practices of racial discrimination and racial segregation exist in violation of state law, and then sometimes in violation of state constitutions? So what I found was that, certainly there's been a lot written about the Great Migration and the attraction of the North, but we knew that there was still discrimination, we knew that there was still segregation. And so I started looking at ideas about custom, about how important custom was in determining whether or not a place was segregated. And I found that more than anything across the 20th century, especially, civil rights were a moving target in the North because unlike Jim Crow laws, it was hard for activists to pin down exactly what the source of discrimination was and how to go about attacking it. And so there were all these really interesting innovations that people tried to try to get at that idea. But I struggled with the dissertation because there's not a lot of conceptualization of the field of African American civil rights in the historiography as it exists now. And so when I was using for my dissertation to frame it were works about the civil rights in the North, the South, the West, but also these state-bound case studies. So there are lots of histories of civil rights in the Midwest that are based on states and are bounded by states, but there aren't really, as far as I could tell, and I still feel this way, that there aren't really good cohesive civil rights histories that bring it all together. So when I was early on in the project, I got some pretty good advice about the dissertation, and I think that one of the great benefits about doing research in the Midwest is that the archives here are really good. So that was one thing that drove me to focus on the Midwest, is that there was a ton of archival material, and no one really paid attention to it. And I think that that's comes from a place of assuming that the South is inherently interesting as a region, the West is inherently interesting as a region. The Midwest is maybe less of a compelling case as of now. I'm not saying that it can't be a case, but right now it's thought of as not being particularly interesting on its own. And so there are a lot of archives that are overlooked, which I think is really good for graduate students. There's a ton that's out there that hasn't been considered. And so when I was looking through archival materials, what I found, and this is one of the things that gets me to where I am today in terms of thinking about a national project, is that the things that I found most interesting were the actions of students. It turns out all over the Midwest, and not just all over the Midwest, but all over the nation. High school students were really involved in civil rights protest and in challenging what they saw as racial discrimination at school. So early on in the dissertation process, my advisor warned me about focusing on the Midwest. He reminded me that it's not developed as a region, and more importantly, he was really concerned about my job prospects, that I wasn't going to be able to find a job if I branded myself as a historian of the Midwest. Or if I did, I may be able to find a position at a regional university, but I wouldn't be very marketable. And I think that that's something that, from my perspective, as the most junior person on this panel, that's actually a real concern, because there aren't jobs for people who study the Midwest, at least in history departments. They just don't exist. I had an interview with a university that is in the Midwest that shall go unnamed, and I knew that they had a history of the Midwest on the books, that there was a course that had been taught there at some point, so I tried to sell that during the interview, that I could totally teach that course. It's going to be a great course. I did not get that job. I don't think that they cared. The search committee wasn't persuaded, and part of that I think was me, but also there's this idea that really sticks, that the Midwest itself is not inherently interesting. And that's what I think that, it's up to scholars, it's up to us to conceptualize the Midwest as a region, to think about how we can make arguments for its inherent interestingness as a place, and also its cohesiveness. Because I think with the current state of Midwestern history, there's so many books, especially for historians, that are considered really central to the field. So things like Richard White's The Middle Ground. Wonderful book, everyone has to read it. Tom Segru's Origins of the Urban Crisis, William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, all of those books are considered to be canonical in the field of American history, and they're all technically about the Midwest. And they're all very much place-based, and they all have things to say about the Midwest as a region, but they're not framed that way. And I think that it's not that there aren't interesting histories out there, but that we don't necessarily know how to put them all together and how to think about them as telling a story that is cohesive, that's coherent. So, like I said, as far as civil rights go, there are really wonderful books on the Midwest, but they tend to be bounded by state boundaries, even when there are a lot of commonalities between them. So this constant tension between what the law says about civil rights and what actually happens on the ground. So in a place like Iowa, where not only does the law say that school segregation is illegal and violates the 14th Amendment, but also you have the Iowa State Supreme Court saying that it's violative of the 14th Amendment, and yet it happens anyway. So that tension is something that's constant. There's also questions about enforcement that are constant. Lots of the Midwestern states had Fair Employment Practices Commissions, had their own FEPCs in the moment when the national FEPC existed during the 1940s. And so there's a lot that brings it together, not to mention the history of the region as the Northwest Territory, a place where slavery was banned. The Midwest as a region, I think, there's a case to be made for it being important and, like I said, inherently interesting. But right now, we're still struggling to sort of to create that, to sort of bound the field and figure out what it is that makes a place Midwestern. Because I think that something that divides Midwestern historians is there's sometimes an assumption that the Midwest is a place of small towns and rural areas. And so studies like Segru's study of Detroit, Arnold Hirsch's study of Chicago, studies of Milwaukee, that those are considered to be kind of outliers. And I think that something that, if we're going to think about the Midwest as a region, we have to figure out how to integrate the rural areas, the small towns, the mid-sized cities, as well as the big cities, the metropolitan areas. Because they're not separate, they're all connected. And so how do we think about bringing them together under an analytical framework and thinking about what the Midwest is? So when I'll close by talking a little bit about a tremendously embarrassing experience of sending out chapters for review. So when I was trying to pitch my project about students and civil rights protests, the reviewers, they were really harsh about my framing of the Midwest. They really didn't like it. They felt like it was a real problem, and that it couldn't be justified, essentially. So they said, if you want to say that you're telling a national story, you have to look outside the Midwest. You have to include the South for sure, and you probably also have to include the West. And this is actually where I've gone with the project, because I felt like that was the message that I wanted to tell, the story that I wanted to tell in the book in the end. But at the same time, that was something that was very frustrating, because I think that critique is not something that you would get if you were studying the South, if you were studying the West. People are going to take it for granted that there are things that we can learn that are significant and that potentially have national significance in those regions, whereas a Midwestern story, you really find an uphill battle. And so I think, the field is fertile. As I said, I think the archives are wonderful. I think that graduate students can make a lot of Midwestern history, but I think that we need to work on conceptualization, and I think that we need to start, especially for people who study civil rights, we have to start thinking beyond state boundaries. We have to think about what the commonalities are, but also how we deal with the urban-rural divide, how we make sense of those things. There are some really fantastic little tidbits that I found that I think do contribute to a bigger story here. So, for example, in Iowa, a place where discrimination was a custom, and so there are people in Iowa who thought that the way to address that then was to change hearts and minds. It was like a hearts and minds campaign. This stuff was really interesting. There were a domestic student exchange where students from poorer urban families would go live in rural places, because the idea was that we just needed to change the way people saw the world, which was avoiding the law and avoiding questions about enforcement. But the idea there that it's already encoded in law, that get people to voluntarily commit to it is something that I think is actually very Midwestern, and that sort of that impulse of toleration, that impulse towards neighborliness, for lack of a better term. But it's things like these that I think potentially are really fertile for further research. So, in sum, I think the big charge is to figure out what makes the Midwest distinct, and how we can think about bounding it as a region and how we justify that. I think that's the big challenge for future historians. But that doesn't mean it can't be done, but I think that we still have a lot of work to do. So.